June 22, 1941, the Western Soviet border. The first rays of the summer sun pierced the dense birch forests, yet brought no warmth. It was the dawn of Operation Barbarossa, a colossal flood of steel pouring onto Russian territory. Young Red Army soldiers, trying to hold their ground, watched columns of German tanks and motorized units advance. In the initial weeks, the German success was too fast, too brutal. Lower-level Soviet commanders, overwhelmed and out of contact, used what they had. Some Soviet officers, relying on prior border skirmish experience and overconfidence in their prototype tanks, told their superiors that these war machines, though powerful, were merely obstacles to be overcome. They underestimated the enemy's coordinated assault and, more importantly, underestimated the retribution the enemy would exact. They believed this was like a summer storm. It would pass. But this was not rain. It was systematic annihilation. Behind the spearhead came thousands of infantry, motorized units, and artillery, all moving with a ruthless rhythm. The early summer concealed the reality of what was to come. In makeshift field headquarters, maps were spread out, marked with red arrows indicating the breathtaking speed of the advance. However, on the opposite side, through the thickets and abandoned wooden villages, there were watchful eyes. These were the rank and file, the Soviet artillerymen squeezed into makeshift defensive positions, who could not see the big picture, only the chilling sound of iron tracks grinding the earth. They knew the steel monsters were coming, the tanks they had seen in exercises, but they had never faced them on this scale, under concentrated fire, and without adequate air support. The afternoon began to fade, the air thick with dust and unreleased tension. In an open area before a small town in Belarus, a Soviet artillery crew was tasked with halting a thrust of German armor. They had good combat cannons, but lacked experience in mobile anti-tank combat. The crew commander, a young man with a face smeared with grease, constantly wiped cold sweat from his brow. He ordered 2 warning shots fired. The guns roared, metal shattered as a round struck a distant German armored vehicle. But instead of retreating, the German column seemed to pause for only a moment, as if annoyed by a small pebble. From the front, the powerful searchlights of medium tanks began to blaze in the deepening twilight, shining directly onto the Russian positions, turning them into exposed targets. A strange silence settled over the Soviet artillery position. After the test shots, no command rang out. There was only the sound of wind whistling through the wires and the creaking of the gun mount under invisible pressure. The eyes of the Soviet soldiers were fixed on the colossal shadows advancing. They could hear the relentless churning of engines inside, the clatter of gears. This delay was not due to fear, but a terrifying realization that what they were preparing to face was beyond anything they had trained for. The German tanks were not rushing forward chaotically. They advanced with cold precision, forming an iron wall that their conventional weapons could not breach. This moment was when the pride of the Red Army shattered, giving way to the awareness of an entirely new kind of war. From behind the German tank formation, a tall, slender, and dark object gradually emerged from the shadows. It was the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, a weapon designed against aircraft, but now deployed as a heavy anti-tank cannon. The Soviet commander gripped his binoculars, his face paling. He recognized the threat instantly. This weapon could punch through the armor of enemy tanks from a great distance. The commander yelled a hoarse order, attempting to redirect his battery's fire, but it was too late. A brilliant white flash tore through the night, followed by a deafening explosion that echoed across the field. An 88mm shell had found its mark. Not a tank, but a Soviet 76mm gun. The gun was torn apart, shrapnel sprayed into the air, and nearby soldiers fell. The first sight of the 88mm fire changed the entire dynamic. The German tanks now moved slightly slower, confident behind their protective shield. Soviet tanks tried to fight back, their own guns firing steadily but in vain. Shells bounced harmlessly off the angled armor of the enemy like marbles. The Soviet soldiers sheltering behind their own tanks realized their own thick steel shell was now not a sanctuary but a prison. Despair spread like dry fire. They began abandoning their posts.
seeking cover or simply turning their backs and fleeing from the sound of engines and the screech of metal crushing all hope.
The Germans did not falter. With their targets clearly designated by the 88mm, the tanks advanced like a giant hammer. They didn't need to close the distance. They fired from afar, safe and accurate. Smoke began to rise from multiple points on the Soviet line. It was the smell of burning oil, melted metal, and things that should not be burning. A T-34 tank, the pride of Soviet industry, was hit in the turret. The hatch blew open with a horrific screech, and the silhouette of survivors tumbled onto the ground, clutching their faces. The scene was chaos, men lying still, others dragging wounded comrades, while German tanks continued their methodical advance, the muzzle flashes of their cannons being deadly stars against the dark battlefield sky.
In that chaos, some Soviet soldiers realized they could not fight steel with steel. They had to fight by crawling under it. Infantry and sapper troops, armed with caustic explosives and makeshift Molotov cocktails, began suicidal assaults. They crawled close to the ground, trying to use the darkness and dust to reach the tracks of the German tanks. The camera focuses on a young soldier crawling amidst the gunfire, his face almost touching the cold mud. He inched inch by inch, his gasps sounding louder than the engines at close range. This was a battle of individual will against mechanical force, a desperate yet heroic defiance.
Despite heavy losses and being forced to retreat from their initial positions, this small but fierce resistance slowed the German machine. Damaged tanks, even if only a stuck track, created a bottleneck in the path of the advance. This gave the Soviet reserve units precious extra minutes to regroup. The surviving soldiers, though defeated in this specific engagement, carried a new memory. The terror of the 88mm was not invincible. It could be dodged, tricked, and most importantly, it could be met with unimaginable recklessness. This lesson was not just retained in their minds, but began to spread through the ragged communication lines. A warning.
Finally, a second dawn broke over the ravaged battlefield. The German tanks had passed, but the victory came at the cost of their initial complacency. The initial scorn for Russian weakness had been replaced by a cold respect, reinforced by smoke and burning wreckage. The Germans' early success, though spectacular, was forever marked by an indelible stain. They had encountered an enemy who did not know how to surrender. For the survivors, the fear of the new weapon had transformed into steely resolve, a bitter lesson in the true cost of war. After this day, there was no more arrogance. There was only cold calculation and the ghost of tall muzzles in the night.